Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. Now, unfortunately, it feels like there's this constant update. Like every 3 to 6 months, I have to come on and tell you guys once again that Europe is falling apart and every bit of free speech is being eradicated. And you think it can't have gotten any worse. It couldn't have gotten any farther. It's already as absurd as it possibly could be. But it turns out that it's not, and there's been a number of different developments since the last time I spoke about this with Harry over at the Lotus Eaters. And Nate Hochman did a good job of kind of bringing all this together, consolidating it, and breaking it down for everybody. So I wanted to bring him on to go ahead and talk about his piece and free speech in general. Nate, thanks for coming on, man.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, man. Good to be here.
Absolutely. So we've had a lot of recent free speech violations in Europe. We, of course, had one guy who was arrested for group chats. We had another guy who was banned from Germany for, just disagreeing with mass immigration. A guy who was arrested for stickers. It's pretty absurd over there. And I want to dive into all the different layers of this. But before we get started, guys, let me tell you a little bit about ISI. Universities today aren't just neglecting real education, they're actively undermining it, and we can't let them get away with it. America was made for an educated and engaged citizenry. The Intercollegiate Studies Institute is here to help. ISI offers programs and opportunities for conservative students across the country. ISI understands that conservatives and right-of-center students feel isolated on college campuses and that you're often fighting for your own reputation, dignity, and future. Through ISI, you can learn about what Russell Kirk called the permanent things, the philosophical and political teachings that shaped and made Western civilization great. ISI offers many opportunities to jumpstart your career. They have fellowships at some of the nation's top conservative publications like National Review, The American Conservative, and The College Thinker. If you're a graduate student, ISI offers funding opportunities to sponsor the next great generation of college professors. Through ISI, you can work with conservative thinkers who are making a difference. Thinkers like Chris Rufo, who currently has an ISI researcher helping him with his book. But perhaps most importantly, ISI offers college students a community of people that can help them grow. If you're a college student, ISI can help you start a student organization or a student newspaper or meet other like-minded students at their various conferences and events. ISI is here to educate the next generation of great Americans. To learn more, go to isi.org. That's isi.org. All right, Nate. So like I said, there's a long list of updates on how Europe has fallen, but let's start at the beginning. What happened in Belgium with this guy who got arrested for being in a group chat?
Yeah, I think I've said this before. One of the charming things about Americans is how little they care about what's going on in other countries. But in this case, I think Americans aren't fully aware, at least your sort of average American isn't fully aware of just how insane things have gotten in Europe. And the most recent sort of high profile example of this was this Belgian politician, in a very American way, I'm sure I'm going to butcher his name, but Dries van Langenhoven, who is from the sort of Flemish region of Belgium, who had served in parliament and was the leader of a pretty significant, substantial right-wing youth activist group with all the sort of normal European right-wing priors. And he got a year in prison and a 16,000 euro fine, which I think is something like $17,500 US dollars for being in a group chat where allegedly offensive memes were being sent. And if that wasn't outrageous enough, he wasn't the person sending the memes. It was his digital proximity to, edgy, whatever, offensive memes that got him a year in prison. Now, I think the important context in that case and in a lot of other cases that I'm sure we'll talk about is that his party that he represented, which was like this Flemish nationalist anti-immigration right-wing party, was surging and is surging in the polls. So, maybe it's a coincidence that the Belgian state just suddenly became extremely interested in his private group chats right around the time that their actual sort of regime hegemony was threatened by the movement he represented. But you see the same coincidence happening over and over again across Europe. So it's pretty clear what the game is actually all about.
Yeah, man, I love Western liberal democracy. You're so free. You can vote for anybody you want as long as they haven't been in a group chat where someone posted a meme that your political enemies might find mildly offensive. Thank God we don't live under Putin. It's just amazing the amount of freedom that people in the West get to enjoy. And if we're not fighting for our democracy, then really, I mean, we could fall under some kind of strange totalitarianism. Book coming out about that on May 7th, by the way. Total State, check it out. So this is kind of amazing. And you're right that the most important thing, a through line through all of the people we're going to talk about today, is really the fact that they represent the possibility of any kind of pushback in Europe. It's very clear that there is a frustration, and when we talk about this, it's not some far right crazy pushback. It is a pretty much basic liberals who just want the ability to say, I think maybe we shouldn't have unlimited immigrants inside our borders. Maybe we shouldn't teach all the kids to mutilate their genitalia. Like just very basic things and nothing crazy for the most part. And yet just the simple opposition, this populist is the word that gets thrown around, which just means democracy we don't like, uprising from many people, is terrifying, kind of these ruling elites. And the crackdown on speech is insane. And like you said, the fact that this guy himself didn't even send the meme, it makes it very clear. I mean, it feels like I could get arrested for having been on Xbox Live 10 years ago, right? Like that's the level we're at now, where any connection, any tenuous connection to someone is immediately a reason to go ahead and imprison them. You don't need any real tangible evidence of a crime because, well, it's thought crime at all. At any point, you can be picked up for it.
No, exactly. To your point about the fact that, all of these parties and movements are routinely, insistently described as far right. If you read any legacy media reporting on it, it's one of the insufferable things about, writing this column is you have to wade through these Washington Post and Politico pieces where it's impossible to sort of get any sort of sentence that isn't laden with these sort of buzzwords. But it's true. And it's actually one of the distinctions between the sort of right-wing nationalist movements in a lot of these European countries and the American understanding of nationalism, conservatism, the right, whatever you want to say, is that social conservatism, as Americans understand it, and it has existed as a political movement since, the 70s and the 80s here, it does not really have a foothold in Europe. And that is expressed in the sense that a lot of these right-wing nationalist parties that are really anti-immigration are in some ways framing their sort of anti-immigration stance as a defense of a certain kind of liberalism. You see that, in the Netherlands, where Geert Wilders won, his party just won this massive sort of upset anti-immigration wave victory, where he rose to prominence as an anti-Islam activist. And part of his critique of Islam was that it was like anti-LGBT, anti-women's rights, anti-feminism. You see the same thing with like Tommy Robinson in the UK. So, it's not the idiom that I would criticize like mass Arab immigration in, but the point is like a lot of these guys are a kind of sort of European liberal, but they, I think in some ways correctly perceive that the defense of a specifically Western European liberalism requires keeping out, the entire population of Syria from your country, especially when you live in a country that's the size of a small northeastern state. So all that is to say, for all of the black pills about Europe, and this entire segment is to an extent about some black pills about Europe. What is true is that the nationalist right in Europe is ascendant, and it's ascendant across a variety of different Western countries. The legacy of Brexit was totally betrayed by the elites in Westminster. But since then, obviously, you've got Hungary, you've got, Emmanuel Macron in the upcoming European elections is facing a viable challenge from the French Nationalist Party. They're ahead in the polls. The Alternative for Deutschland, the Alternative for Germany in Germany, which is a nationalist party, is they're talking about banning it outright in Germany because it's surging in the polls. It's arguably the most popular party in large parts of Germany. In the Netherlands, they just had this nationalist uprising where they won power. You can go down the list. Belgium, we were just talking about. Italy, so in most of these Western European countries, it's a potent force. In some of them, they have actually won power. And you can criticize each of these different nationalist movements for various reasons or for various things. But the point is, like, that's where the small d democratic energy is. And it is directly opposed to the sort of hegemonic regime which has governed in Europe for the past 50, 60 plus years. And unlike America, they have hate speech laws there. And they are increasingly willing to use them in the most draconian the most authoritarian, the most, Putinistic, whatever you want to describe it, way. And these examples I was talking about in my column are just a few of those.
Yeah, Melania, I know, has been a big disappointment to a lot of people. The press was hyping her up as the descendant of Mussolini, the next coming of fascism in Italy, and she's just letting in basically a large amount of migrants. There's not a huge change there, and so a lot of people are skeptical. But you're right that this is the zeitgeist, right? Whether it is everything it needs to be, whether it is actually culminating in the current change of immigration policy necessary to arrest this massive wave, it is at least clear that there is a desire of the people to see a significant change, and that does matter, even if unfortunately currently there aren't people who are willing to go ahead and draw those bright lines. But you spoke about Germany, and that means we should probably go ahead and get to Martin Sellner. He goes in there and tries to give a speech about immigration restriction. He gets shut down and arrested by the police just for talking about this, and not even allowed to suggest in Germany that perhaps you don't need to have, like you said, the entire population of Syria moving in next door. And not only does he get arrested, he's banned from the country for 3 years, I believe now. You can't even enter it, because it's so dangerous that anyone might suggest that you shouldn't have wide open immigration. And I understand that at some level this is part of their power, right? Like it's critical. This is the alliance, the pan-European alliance, I guess, because of the kind of the progressive status quo is mass immigration. But at some point you have to think that this is a suicide pact, right? Every one of these countries is dealing with this, and they're basically at this point planning to imprison their native population, just to shut them up long enough to make sure that another population can be moved in. How long can a place like Germany continue to exist in this manner?
It's an important point, and you could say the same thing to an extent, I think, about the quote-unquote status quo in America. Is one of the weird paradoxes of the sort of hegemonic regimes in the West today is that the paradigm they're defending is not just unstable, it's destabilizing. So they are going to increasingly extreme lengths to try to defend a paradigm that in some ways is subverting their own power. Now, whether or not the subversion of their own power leads to right-wing nationalists eventually coming into power, I don't know. But the point is, in some ways, I don't want to give them any tips, but in some ways, making certain concessions would probably serve their own interests, because you've seen some sort of parties do this, like in Scandinavia, you've had a bunch of center-left parties make certain concessions to the anti-immigration sentiment in order to maintain power, and to varying degrees of success. But in a lot of these other places, they are just so ideologically committed, or perhaps because of material interests. I don't know the exact motivations of each of these parties, but they are so committed to mass immigration that they are unable to make concessions to parties like the AfD in Germany, the anti-immigration wave in Belgium and Netherlands, et cetera. And what you are going to increasingly see, I think this is undeniable now, is things like what you saw in Ireland at the end of last year, where there's this mass uprising of riots from native Irish people who have been holding peaceful protests for years, the better part of at least a decade, against immigration. And these were like the definition of peaceful protests. Like the Irish would go out and, with their babies and their strollers and, sing songs, and you have church groups protesting mass immigration. And you had all of these high profile cases of, migrant attacks at various places in Ireland, which is a very small, traditionally very homogenous country. And you had waves of migrants just getting dumped into these small rural Irish towns. Their housing crisis is the direct result of mass immigration. Their welfare system is about to collapse, arguably. So you had all these real problems, and the native Irish population had been trying to make their voice heard, and the government had been doing the opposite of listening to them. They'd been ratcheting up the immigration levels. And then you had this grotesque stabbing by, I think it was an Algerian national, of 3 young Irish children, and Ireland exploded. Like all of Dublin was on fire for a couple of days. The population was increasingly incensed. And most recently, Leo Varadkar, the head of Ireland's government, resigned, I think, in no small part because of this. So it's a perfect example, right, where you try to keep the lid on as the boiling point, continues to go up. And eventually it does boil over, and people in power are their power is destabilized as a result of that. So I don't know if a lot of these other people are going to learn their lesson. But you're absolutely right that the current status quo is actually probably weakening their hold on power in some ways.
Yeah, I've got an ongoing bet with my buddy Nima Parvina, academic agent, that the woke will not be put away. And one of the reasons I'm very sure that I'm going to hold a cigar in victory in my right hand from Nima Parvini is because of this exact fact, right? Every one of these ruling elites they have a suicide pact going. Their current policies are unsustainable. They will destroy their country, and they only seem to be cracking down. They only seem to be accelerating this. They seem to be becoming more and more just completely mad over the need to push this policy. And when you're in that kind of extreme religious fervor, you're not pulling back because you're going to make smart tactical decisions. Like, those off ramps are all behind you at this point. And so I think that's actually the toughest thing for a lot of these European countries is probably to realize is that kind of all the easy decisions are in the rear view mirror at this point, and that's the only thing left is very hard decisions, and which makes political change even more difficult because you really have to start talking about deportations and other things that would have been it would have been a lot easier simply to slow down this process. But now you actually have to extract foreign populations if you want to be able to save your country at this point. And that, of course, is a far more difficult thing to do. And so that really exacerbates the situation. And it really is amazing to me that all of this has happened at every one of these countries at the same time. Every one of these elites, every one of them seems to be pushing the same direction. And the native populations are always trapped. We have the same thing to a lesser extent in the US. Luckily, we're a larger country with a lot more kind of space to breathe on this issue. But we have the same problem where it doesn't matter if the Republicans are in power, and it doesn't matter if we get a new GOP speaker. The most important thing is how much money can we get to Ukraine? How much money can we get to Israel? The major priority is building border walls between Israel and Palestine and not on our own border. And it doesn't seem to matter which half of the managerial elite we put into power. I mean, Trump slowed down entries, which is good. That there was a notable drop, and that kind of shows you how simple the policy change can be. Simply letting people know that there just isn't going to be free stuff and jobs for them when you get there shuts down a large amount of your mass immigration. Just knowing that you're not going to immediately be welcomed into the country, because this mass immigration journey is actually very dangerous for a lot of people. It's very expensive. It comes at a high personal cost. And the only reason you're going to engage in that is if you know that there's an incentive once you get there. And so Trump just saying, no, that's not going to exist for you was enough to reduce a large amount. There wasn't a radical change really in border enforcement. And that's why the whole Biden, I need more money, I need more laws thing is just garbage. It's obviously not the case. But it feels like just every one of these governments is just captured by both sides. You look at the UK, where the Conservatives have been in power, they're dominating, the Tories dominate, and still the flow of immigration continues. The entire Brexit referendum was about this. The entire kind of elevation of them to power was about this, and yet nothing happens. The one thing that can't change is the flow of illegal immigrants into Western nations.
It was much worse than nothing happening, actually. Boris Johnson and subsequent Tory leadership presided over a unprecedented increase in immigration, which again it is difficult to think. In general, there are a lot of right-wing populists in a lot of different Western countries have failed their voters in fundamental ways. It is difficult to think of a political failure and a political betrayal so egregious, at least in modern or recent history, as that of the Tories and Brexit, right? I mean, they were smart enough to know that it was about immigration. They can't, plead ignorance on that front. And yet they presided over a massive increase of immigration into the United Kingdom. And, the thing to sort of remember, you alluded to it earlier, was these European countries, I lived in, just because of where my family was working in high school, I lived in Amsterdam. And you drive to neighboring European countries in a couple hours. Like it's like driving between states in the Northeast. So a lot of these countries are the size of New York City, or maybe slightly bigger, slightly more landmass. They've got some rural areas. But when you talk about immigration into these little sort of nation states, the drastic effect of something like that, particularly when it's a sort of third world population that is radically different from the native population with completely different customs, practices, beliefs, etc. Like in some ways, it's actually surprising there hasn't been more of a response from the native populations, given the drastic and radical changes that have been wrought in their countries as a result of this phenomenon in a relatively short period of time. I mean, the Syrian refugee crisis was what, like 2014, something like that. So frankly, I'm surprised we haven't seen more sort of Dublin riots. And now obviously you are seeing an expression of that in elections in the small d democratic will. But you have to wonder, like, when these people keep voting this way and all they get is more immigration, like, it's like that Simpson meme of the sort of 2004 Bush election where he presses the carry button and they just keep saying Bush. When they keep voting for change and they keep getting not just more of the same, but in many cases a ratcheting up of the problem they're voting against. That was what was true of Meloni in Italy. She presided over an unprecedented increase in immigration. At a certain point, like, you can't blame these people for losing faith in the democratic process. And I think, everyone should be worried about what happens then, because I think that the riots like we saw in Dublin and, here in America, what we saw with things like January 6th are probably only going to be the beginning unless people actually eventually get what they vote for.
Yeah, I want to go into that in more depth because I think you're exactly right, and that's only going to get more important. But before we do, guys, I need to tell you about your absolute moral duty to hire based people. If you are running a company, I don't want to hear anything other than I hired only the most base people because you have resources like New Founding. Hey guys, I need to tell you about today's sponsor, New Founding Talent. Look, we all know that the job market is a disaster right now. Based people can't find good companies to work for, and good companies can't find anybody to get the job done. The competency crisis is very, very real. So how do we get these two incredibly important groups together? We need organizations like New Founding. New Founding has created a network of high excellence professionals who are seeking to join grounded American businesses. These are individuals often in elite organizations who are ready for a team and a mission that supports their values instead of working against them. Aligned companies are already using this network to hire high trust, exceptional individuals who can match the culture and mission of their teams. So if you're looking for better employees to build a better world, you need to go ahead and apply for access to the New Founding Talent Network at newfounding.com/talent. You'll get connected with candidates who will build your business. That's newfounding.com/talent. Check it out today. All right. So in the UK, there was this crazy instance. A guy got arrested for having stickers. You need the sticker license in UK to do the meme. Where's your sticker license? So what happened here?
So he was, again, this was an anti-immigration activist. I can't remember the specific group he was a part of, but it was, right-wing nationalist, anti-immigration European group. His name was Samuel Malia. And I think he had a Telegram channel or group chat with like 3,000 or 4,000 people in it. And he was sending out like templates for printable stickers that were anti-immigration stickers and mass immigration. It was sort of but within the American Overton window, it was stuff like, will the native British people be replaced in their homeland? Something like that, right? But it was anti-immigration stickers. It was squarely within certainly any American conception of free speech. And he was arrested and given 2 years in jail for inciting racial hatred. And I read it's called like the Crown's prosecutor statement there. It was sort of beyond parody if it wasn't so dark about the statement, where they had this sort of long description of how he was found with stickers in his wallet, and they opened his wallet to pull out the stickers, and the stickers had slogans expressing views of a nationalist nature. And views of a nationalist nature, at least in public, are apparently meriting 2 years in jail in the United Kingdom now. And like it was like a drug possession charge. It was what they were charging him with was possession of stickers with intent to distribute. Like that was literally the language that they used. So it's
hard stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, really. It's like he had a kilo of crack cocaine or something, But that is what the UK is at now. And again, just to reiterate, like this is under a quote unquote conservative government, capital C, capital P conservative party. And if you look at like the headlines in UK, like the Conservative Party, with a few notable exceptions, is all for this, just like they're all for mass immigration. So especially in the UK, there really isn't an actual political right at all anymore. And I have perpetual gripes about the GOP. I think they're constantly failing their voters. They're certainly constantly disappointing me. But they are substantially better, and the conservative infrastructure we have to actually apply pressure to the GOP is substantially better than anything in the UK, where this stuff is happening not just with the consent of the governing conservative majority, but often with the active encouragement of it.
Yeah, you spoke about the need to crack down on speech because of the constant unrest, because both sides are just not reacting. There is no political outlet. Both sides are gung-ho behind these policies. It doesn't matter who you vote for. And so you get this rage bubbling up. That's how you get the protests in Ireland. That's how those develop into riots. And it's interesting because, of course, our own government in the United States used social media pretty aggressively to create color revolutions in other states. That's how we ended up with the Arab Spring and many of these others. That's how Ukraine has its current government. It's very democratically elected government. I assure you, very democratically elected, certainly not placed in charge by Blue America and the CIA. And so when you have this technology, you're familiar with how to manipulate it, you need to shut it down. And so these Western governments, who have on pretty regular basis used social media as a way to unseat anybody who wasn't going to bow to the global Western order, went ahead and basically realized that they need to start cutting their own citizens off from this very same technology. It's dangerous to have their people plugged in to the same outlets, because who knows if those people might try to organize alongside them. And that's why I think we've seen this aggressive policing of basically any anti-immigration rhetoric and the use of social media, because they understand the power that this disruptive tool has, and they want to make sure that there isn't any kind of organic response to the very thing that they're trying to implement in their own country.
Yeah, you never expect the color revolution to come home. It's supposed to be something that you do to other countries. It's not something that's supposed to happen to your regime at home. But that's exactly right. It is fascinating to watch the rhetoric of people like Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and sort of like quintessential regime aligned Democrats, security state technocrats, managerial elites, whatever, in the sort of early 2000s, in the lead up to the Arab Spring, where they're talking about social media companies as these beacons of democracy, where people can exchange information and ideas that subvert, like the authoritarian regimes. And this is how you have sort of mass democratic uprisings. And it is squarely at odds with the way that any of those people talk about social media today. I mean, Barack Obama was out there during the Arab Spring touting Twitter. He was asked, I think in 2018 or 2019, what he thought the biggest threat to democracy was today. He said internet disinformation, right? So it's like a Frankenstein's monster phenomenon, where they have created something that they correctly saw as empowering small d democracy, but they never expected that actually empowering small d democracy would lead to democratic uprising here as well. So that's the conundrum that I think they find themselves in. And I think, it is why they are increasingly hysterical about technological disinformation, et cetera. Now, like, that isn't really a word that was in our lexicon 5 years ago. And now there's an entire multi-billion-dollar industry dedicated to, working people up into fits of hysterics about it. And there's an obvious reason for that, right? Which is what you were just saying.
Yeah, there's a morbid fascination. I understand it's evil, but as, kind of a professional word cell, I do find the making of the sausage fascinating. I appreciate the craft of the newspeak, even if I know it's totally evil. It's like, well, I got to give you guys credit. That is an impressive way to manipulate that and manufacture that. Amazing that you managed to spin this entire industry up in just a few years. And and again, just explode, of course, your left-wing patronage and everything inside of it. It's beautiful. It's horrifying, but it's beautiful in a way. It's like the creation of a Death Star. You're awed by it, even if you know it's about to blow you up. But I have to ask you this. We talk about free speech in Europe, and I wonder sometimes if this is a projection backwards of American and specifically Anglo norms onto a continent that wasn't maybe this homogenous. Obviously, America has kind of the tradition carried over from the UK of kind of a more rights-based society, a Bill of Rights, having the ability to have free speech. That's not necessarily a pan-European value in the way that I think we often pretend that it is. We may not have God emperors in Europe the way that you did in China and other places, and more explicitly. But I feel like that ability to voice your opinion and kind of have that limited constitutional monarchy and things really are straight out of the Magna Carta and the kind of the chain of custody that delivers that into the American tradition. And in many ways, because the United States kind of conquered the world in World War II and exported its government to every European country, we now pretend like this is a long European tradition when maybe it's not, and we shouldn't be as surprised that most of these countries kind of just went back to their norm once it became more politically convenient.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. What I will say is that I think I don't know exactly quite how to formulate it. I think while there is not necessarily a sort of rights-based, almost sort of libertarian in an older sense of the word tradition that is unique to the Anglosphere, although we were just talking about what was happening in the UK. So I think insofar as sort of traditional Anglo values were something that was born in the UK, the situation is worse in the UK now than it is in a lot of mainland European countries. But it is certainly true that there's a sort of much more fierce, much more ardent tradition of sort of smaller Republican liberty in the Anglo tradition. With that being said, I think there is something that is distinctly sort of, what has defined Western civilization for the last 1,000 years at least is a sort of restlessness, a dynamism, a certain amount of expansionism, which led to the West going beyond its borders to conquer the entire world and build empires. And back home, that led to its own sort of dynamism that led itself, I think, to the sort of development of broadly self-governing societies, where in a lot of these mainland European countries, before you had like the effective neutering of the monarchies, you still had an enormous amount of independence, both at the individual and the communal level. You had city-states, obviously going all the way back to ancient Greece. You had various sort of developing of a conception of liberty, a conception of rights, like all of those things. Now we talk about them as abstract ideological concepts, and they've been totally perverted and bastardized more recently. But they were originally terms that political theorists developed to describe conditions that already existed on the ground in Europe. And I think that is true in a variety of different places. But it is a tradition that I think runs across the West. It isn't unique to the Anglosphere. And in many ways traditionally did distinguish the West from competing or rival civilizations. Like Chinese civilization, which is sort of like the major other world civilization, had like millennia long dynasties with very little change, large sort of bureaucratic structures. And that was just sort of the status quo. And it was the status quo for your great-grandfather, and it would be the status quo for your great-grandchildren. You had dynasties in Europe, but there was much more dynamism, much more change, and much more of a sort of spirit of independence. And even, I would venture, a form of a spirit of liberty that runs across the West. So that's a long way of saying what is happening now. I think you are right, and other people have said this, that in places like Italy or Belgium or wherever, they are much more used to a level of unfreedom than like Americans or even other kinds of Anglos are. But it is also still true that the West has been defined by a certain kind of dynamic independence, which is obviously at odds with what these regimes are trying to do today.
For sure. And like you said, luckily in America, there is a different dynamic. Like you, I am very sure that if the GOP was to be destroyed tomorrow, that would actually be a problem for the Democratic problem for the party. That would not be a solution. That's actually one of the things that the GOP does. However, it's true that the conservative base, at least, really does genuinely have a level of resistance to the progressive mindset that simply doesn't exist in other European countries, I think, at the same level of fervor. In the GOP, you still pretty much have to be anti-immigration. You have to be anti-illegal immigration for sure. And growingly, and now it's even more okay to just be anti-immigration, even legally. And I think that's important. That's critical. That's a very positive shift that we've seen inside the party. We're getting rid of kind of this Cato Institute conservatism. The quicker the better. So that is a heartening change to see. However, while we do know that the First Amendment is, that the Constitution isn't going to protect anything at this point, but the vestiges of it, like kind of the story that we tell ourselves, or at least half the country tells itself, still lends those constitutional protections a level of legitimacy that the government kind of has to pretend is real. They have to at least work around pretty aggressively, and that means that we have a lot more free speech in the United States. It's still an important kind of fire break at some level between us and the growing totalitarianism, and because of that, it's easy for us to say, like, well, at least we've got the First Amendment and we'll be fine here, and that's not a problem, and we don't need to worry about that. But of course, as you mentioned in your piece, Douglas Mackey has been sentenced to 7 months of jail for memes. I mean, at least in the United States, they have to pretend it's something else. It's like, oh, he stopped people from voting or some garbage. When it's like, no, he made fun of Hillary Clinton too effectively. Ricky Vaughn was too good of a poster, and that's why he has to be sentenced to jail. That's really all there is to it. Yeah, it's too powerful. His power level's too high. And so that really is the long and the short of it. But they have to at least pretend there's something else. There's a level of formality. Oh, it's not the speech. It's and they move his venue because the communication went through internet wires somewhere. That's literally it's an amazing justification. It's an amazing legal novelty. But the fact that that's coming in the United States is still terrifying. We make fun of Belgium for some guy getting memes in group chat, but really, how far away is Douglas Mackey's case from this?
Well, not just that, but also the introduction of these sort of quasi-private, not really quite private, but still not subject to the same sort of constitutional impositions, technology platforms where increasingly that is the public square. That is where the conversation takes place. If you don't have access to those, then you are effectively unpersoned in large parts of American life. Like, that raises the question of, like, even if you have sort of certain vestiges, cultural, institutional, et cetera, of a sort of First Amendment framework that would protect against, and I mean, they're not fully protecting against in the case of Douglas Mackey, but are at least holding at bay the kind of direct state tyranny that you're seeing in Europe. If the government can outsource this to Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, it is effectively getting the same bang for its buck. It's not, it might not be able to do certain things on the margins, but that's effectively the same effect, because the effect they're looking for, of course, is to excise these figures and their ideas from the public square so that the fewest people possible hear them, right? That's what they're trying to do in Europe. That's what they're trying to do in America. And increasingly, where everything is online, you can do that pretty well if you have, what happened post J6, where every single technology platform in uniform banned Donald Trump, right? Like, Donald Trump is unique in that he has a big enough megaphone and profile that he can get past that. And then you have Elon Musk coming on. He's at least allowed to be back on Twitter, even if he isn't using it. But that level of coordination, which you have seen in smaller scale cases than Donald Trump, allows them to get 80, 90% of the way there, which is why I think, I've become increasingly convinced that I always obviously thought censorship and free speech were issues. I've become increasingly convinced that they are sort of the defining issues of our time. I mean, obviously you could make a strong case, I would say, that mass immigration is the issue of our time. I see them as inextricably linked to one another. But there's an argument you can make where it's like, you aren't even going to be able to make the case against mass immigration, or even show people what mass immigration looks like in practice, if you can't post, if you can't, get your ideas and your videos and your images out there. And this, I was thinking about this the other day. It's bizarre that in the wake of 2020, there was a period where Republicans were at least talking about this. And most of them weren't actually interested in doing anything about it. But because it was in the zeitgeist, their feet were getting held to the fire to a certain extent. And it is not, I think it is not being discussed with the amount of urgency that is required by Republicans and to an extent by the sort of conservatives who are responsible for holding their feet to the fire. I think it is the issue of our time, arguably, and I think it will continue to be until there's some sort of resolution.
Yeah, I think you're right that these are actually just linked together, that they are symbiotic, because the mass immigration, and we'll just put our cards on the table here. The hour's too late to beat around the bush here. The reason mass immigration is important is because democracy, popular sovereignty, is the legitimating force in the United States. And whatever people, these people can't vote, they can't vote. Yeah, of course they're going to vote, guys. Absolutely. Yeah. Like, they're going out of their way to make sure they don't have IDs. They're doing all the balloting, the mail-in ballots. They know that once they get enough people in here, they're going to get an amnesty, that the things will shift. This is absolutely about changing the voter base, making sure that the people who provide the legitimacy, provide popular sovereignty, are different, and make sure that they'll vote the way that the left wants to. And so they have to bring people in to shut down the free speech. If you get a critical amount of people who don't care about free speech because they're not from this tradition, they don't have that connection and that value, they will eventually just go ahead and give it up because it doesn't matter to them, so they can get free stuff. And the same thing, and so that the free speech and the mass immigration are exactly the same issue, because that's how they get rid of the free speech, and they need to get rid of the free speech to continue that process. And so these things are absolutely 100% connected. Now, most of the opposition to this is on the right, though, as we know, the GOP is a wildly imperfect tool for this. And so as we both already kind of pointed out. And so I want to go ahead and show people something that dropped just an hour before we got on here. And what happened was Greg Abbott has been great. And this is the problem. Greg Abbott has been great on certain things like illegal immigration. He's been good on things like child mutilation, the trans stuff for kids. He's been good on things. And so Greg Abbott, in many ways, is leading the charge in a lot of areas that conservatives would like to see changes made. However, Greg Abbott just issued today a tweet. He proudly tweeted out that, we're not going to tolerate anti-Semitism in Texas. It's terrifying, blah, blah, blah. And, this has been a wave. We've seen a lot of pressure post kind of the October 7th attacks in Israel and the horrific stuff that happened there, and the kind of reaction by many progressives, especially Palestinian students or students aligned with the Palestinian cause. We've seen a lot of pressure to kind of cancel, get people fired. The Harvard president was fired. I want to be really clear. Claudine Gay was not fired for her plagiarism. No one cares about her plagiarism. She was fired because she did not protect Jewish students from Palestinian criticism. And so, there's obviously concern for safety. And as far as you're securing the physical safety of students and making sure that they're not intimidated on campus, okay, that's entirely reasonable. That's the job of the government, is to secure people's safety. You're on strong grounds there. You have a legitimate case. However, there's been a wave of these. DeSantis, I know South Dakota had some legislation involved like this. And now Greg Abbott has gone ahead and tweeted out this. It talks about how we have to be careful and protect, our Jewish students, that kind of thing. Anti-Semitism, very bad. However, the last paragraph here is the chilling one. This is the text that Greg Abbott included in his tweet. I'm not making anything up here. I'm not exacerbating this. Now, I don't know what the actual text of his bill, or his executive order, rather, this isn't a bill, is going to be. However, this is the language he tweeted out in the press release below his tweet. And the last paragraph says, the governor's executive order requires that all higher education institutions in Texas review their free speech policies to establish appropriate punishment for anti-Semitic rhetoric on college and university campuses. Not action, not violence, not intimidation, rhetoric. That is speech. I want them to review their free speech policies and make sure there is punishment for speech I don't like. Now, again, you should not be mean to people. You should not be mean to people based on their race, and that includes Jewish people. However, there is a terrifying amount of the guys who are supposed to be protecting free speech, the guys who are supposed to be stopping this chilling of speech, this intimidation by the government, using anti-Semitism as an excuse to say, we are going to stop explicitly. We are going to create punishment for anti-Semitic rhetoric on college campuses. I mean, what do you do at this point when the guys who are, once again, supposed to be defending us from this stuff are the very ones putting it out?
Yeah, it's been remarkable since October 7th to watch conservatives just enthusiastically embrace, at least in this specific context, like everything they spent the past 5 years, I think, rightly denouncing: DEI, censorship, anti-free speech, measures, et cetera. I understand, I've seen some disturbing clips from campuses as well of, kids getting targeted because they're Jewish, et cetera. Obviously, to your point, that's unacceptable. It's unacceptable on like race and religion neutral grounds. That just should be unacceptable on campuses, period. But the, stuff like this, like you were saying, Abbott's move in this regard is not unique. It's something you've been seeing and certainly has been getting full-throated support from the entire GOP. I think Abbott a couple years ago, I don't know what ended up with it, but he banned Gab on the basis that it was like proliferating, anti-Semitism or something like that. This is essentially exactly what the left has been doing for a very long time, just in the specific context of anti-Semitism. And it's among many other reasons to object to it. Like the obvious question when he says something like there'll be appropriate punishments for anti-Semitic rhetoric is, what is anti-Semitism? Because, the past sort of 5 months or so has demonstrated there's a substantial amount of disagreement about what does and doesn't constitute anti-Semitism. And, just in terms of the left alone, we've seen what they think anti-Semitism is. And on university campuses, who's in control? The left, right? So you're giving the left another tool to say, well, this is what anti-Semitism is. Thank you very much, Governor Abbott. We'll take that increased, bureaucratic power, and we're going to punish it. Who do you think the left-wing administrators on university campuses are going to go after with this newfound, DEI adjacent power? They're going to go after people, whatever, criticizing George Soros, whatever the left calls anti-Semitism. They're not going to, maybe they will go after like pro-Palestinian people as well. I don't know the exact text of the bill, but the point is especially in the context of the universities, where any sane person who's been paying a modicum of attention over the past few years knows it's not right-wingers in control. It's left-wingers in control. You are seeing effectively in all these different measures a beefing up of the DEI regime and it's crazy because the entire sort of donor war on like Harvard and Brown, et cetera, was framed as this anti-DEI campaign. But if you actually look at the material effect, what it ended up doing in most of these sort of elite Ivy League schools was beefing up the DEI department. I was waging for about a month there, like a one-man Twitter jihad against Bill Ackman, because he was someone who was just driving me crazy because he was lying. And he was
tweeting out pictures of himself as Caesar.
As a gladiator, right? I mean, that alone was just like insufferable to me. But even more fundamentally, he was conscripting good, decent conservatives who correctly and legitimately cared about DEI into his fight against Claudine Gay and Harvard on the basis of something that had nothing to do with DEI. And, that was apparent when after he got Claudine Gay fired, he turned around and gave $1 million to like a Democrat who had a DEI plank on his platform, right? So, what Ackman and a lot of other sort of people in that space did was effectively adopt the language of sort of anti-DEI for a brief moment in pursuit of beefing up the DEI bureaucracy. And that's exactly what Harvard did. You know what Harvard did? They didn't dismantle their DEI department. They added anti-Semitism to the DEI sort of regime, right? And it's like, okay, so now you have more DEI bureaucrats. They're all left-wing. The DEI regime is stronger today than it was on October 7th, at least at places like Harvard. And it did the exact opposite of what all these good, decent conservatives thought they were doing by supporting this campaign. So,
and it's even better than that, because Chris Rufo spearheaded this. And it's like, oh, the anti-DEI wave is defeating it. No, that's not the power that's unseating the person you're unseating. And not only that, but now all the Democrats that wanted to get rid of Claudine or punish the pro-Palestinian woke wing of kind of the left-wing power structure, they get to blame the right. They get to blame, it's Rufo. It's the right.
Racism,
the dangerous. It's the racist that over on the right. They're the dangerous ones. We're not the ones that did this to you, even though we totally did. We get to use Rufo as our wedge, and we get to blame him. He's the boogeyman. And so this internecine warfare is waged with the conservative activists as the pawns in kind of this whole play. And it's terrifying, like you said, because obviously, like the left is going to be the ones in power. They're the ones who are going to wield this. They're the ones who are going to decide who is going to be destroyed, who's going to be attacked by this. But the right is doing their job for them on every level. We just had a discussion on Palm Sunday on conservative Twitter about whether Christ is King is an anti-Semitic phrase. In fact, this is still going on. There's still people just insanely, blurting this out. And if we have laws like this being put in place by conservative governors, we have the commands like this being issued by the GOP. Again, the question becomes: is there anyone with the courage to actually represent most of the conservative base who don't want this stuff, who don't want this garbage, who want to be able to speak and want to be able to show their difference and their disagreement with what is going on here? It's very clear that across the parties, even across the activist and commentator sphere of this, that there's just no home for people who want to be able to say, maybe we shouldn't be involved with this country. Maybe we don't have to give our money and our blood and our foreign policy around this particular foreign power. Maybe we can care about this country and focus here. And that's a position that's not acceptable anywhere. And the fact that the definition of anti-Semitism, like you said, can be altered by the left or the right immediately to go ahead and punish anyone is terrifying. What I've noticed in all of these actually has been that they all mention the importance of linking the university's definition of anti-Semitism to a third party, to another organization. Now, I think that most of the people who are saying that will say, oh, well, the left is going to manipulate it, so we have to take it out of the hands of the people in the administration because they're leftists and they'll use it, they'll manipulate it. They'll use it to, like, I don't know, empower the Palestinian protesters or whatever. But it feels like the actual answer to this is actually we're just going to link this to pressure organizations like the ADL, or it probably won't be explicitly ADL because they're so obviously progressive, but it'll be some, slightly less left-wing ADL variant that will then be the ones that get to define what is now apparently illegal on a college campus because a Republican said so.
I think you're even giving them too much credit, like in terms of it not being the ADL. Like when the Republicans were holding these hearings on anti-Semitism on campuses, they invited the ADL to testify, which is like the ADL has spent, the past whatever, I don't know how many decades advocating for everything that Republicans claim to be against. So, it was remarkable seeing Jonathan Greenblatt, the head of the ADL, go on Squawk Box or one of these TV shows, Sunday TV shows, and like pound the table and complain about the victim Olympics on campus, and it was like, it should be obvious to you guys what is happening here, right? Like, does Jonathan Greenblatt actually care about the victim Olympics on campus? No, he wants to see, like, the DEI regime beefed up. And actually they interviewed in a separate piece around the same time the former vice president of the ADL, and she said this. She was like, we don't want to dismantle the DEI regime. We just want to expand it to include anti-Semitism. So like every step of the way, the Greenblatt one is the most shameless because everyone knows what Greenblatt is actually about, which is not dismantling DEI. But you had this, this mass sort of mobilization of people, including, like I said, I think a lot of conservatives who are decent, smart people who just got taken for a ride on this one, mobilize in the name of deconstructing, dismantling the DEI apparatus. And again, you look around you now, and what's the net result post October 7th is, at the very least, it's neutral. And in some of these places, it's that the DEI regime and its sort of attendant bureaucratic branches are more powerful than they were on October 7th.
Yeah, and the most egregious part about all of this, I think the thing that really inflames people's anger, rightfully so, is that for at least a decade, I mean, it's been more than that kind of below the surface, but explicitly over the last decade, there's been a jihad against, white straight males on college campuses. The hate has been explicit. Entire books and papers are written about the elimination of whiteness. Corporate trainings are done by Coca-Cola on how this needs to be wiped out. College professors call openly for white G word. I don't want the YouTube to trigger here. They this is not some conspiracy theory. You can just post all of the articles and books written by academics. Protests are held. Things sometimes get violent, all in the name of attacking white European descendants, and nothing from the right, other than like, oh, the wacky social justice warriors, they're going crazy, gotta do a bunch of YouTube episodes about them, but no action, no impetus from the GOP anywhere to put any of this to bed. And then all of a sudden it turns out that actually Jewish people are colonizers and Jewish people are qualified as white, and all of a sudden they get put in the same box as white people have been in the last 10 years on all college campuses. And all of a sudden, magically, snap into it, man. Every GOP governor, every activist, we're on top of this, man. We got to take real substantive action. That's great. What happened? What's the lag there? I think it's pretty obvious to people that the GOP is fine with identity politics. They embrace identity politics for all of their whinging about the end of identity politics and colorblind society and everything. They play identity politics all the time. They invest in it very heavily. And when it comes to the type of identity politics that is pre-approved and okay on the GOP, they snap to and go ahead and jump into action the minute that a group that they feel needs to be protected, gets in trouble.
Yeah, I wrote a column, or I guess it was like an essay for the American Conservative, like a month after October 7th, maybe a couple months, making precisely the point that you just made, which is like, you had this shocking mobilization, shocking at least from the conservative perspective. I had never seen anything like it in my lifetime, at least as long as I've been in politics, when you started to see these like anti-Israel uprisings on these elite campuses, where all of these gajillionaire donors, right? Like you had obviously Ackman, you had Ken Griffin at Harvard, you had a bunch of different guys at UPenn. All of these gajillionaire Republican donors, for the most part, were pulling millions of dollars from the universities within weeks of October 7th. And surprise, surprise, these things have material power. They forced concessions on the behalf of the university administrations, the administrators, the college presidents. They got a couple of them fired. Liz McGill at UPenn, Claudine Gay at Harvard. This was their red line, right? Like that they were not going to stand for these uprisings on campus. And the donors were just one component of it, right? Like you had the Republican Party mobilized in unison to hold these hearings, and it was the only thing Fox News was talking about for weeks on end. And, you had one of those conservative groups, I can't remember which one, like put up the doxing truck on the Harvard campus where they were broadcasting the names of all of these kids who like signed this letter. And I was like, all right, like, great. Like that's your cause, go for it. But to your point, like, what's been happening on college campuses for the past 2 decades? Like, I certainly can tell you from my experience that you were seeing openly G-word idle rhetoric directed towards white people, especially straight white men. And not just in like the sort of most brazen, open, outrageous sense, but that sort of sentiment was embedded into the way they taught everything. Right? This is not, news to anyone who pays any attention to what happens on college campuses. And what's more, like you were talking about corporate trainings, like the sort of rolling revolution that has swept across America over the last 5 years, exacerbated, accelerated post BLM in 2020. Its seat was these elite universities, right? Like it began at the universities, the ideas that proliferated, the tactics began at the universities. And then, these elite universities, they nurture the next generation of elites. They go out into our elite institutions. And, a couple of years later, you get like the New York Times firing its editorial board, the head of its editorial page because he published a Tom Cotton op-ed, right? that pipeline is well sort of documented. So it wasn't just the universities. This extremely toxic, extremely like destructive anti-civilizational ideology had been festering in plain sight for a very long time. And all these Republican donors had been giving millions of dollars to these universities while it was happening out in public. They weren't trying to hide it. They were very proud and open about it. And then, like within weeks of October 7th, all of a sudden, like this was the red line. The conservative donors, the conservative activist groups, the Republican Party itself, all of them, one of the enraging things to me about the sort of post-October 7th response was what it proved was that, like, okay, you guys were actually capable of this all along, right? You could have done it. You had the power to do it, and you chose not to because you didn't care enough about it. And that, to me, is the biggest indictment. It's not the fact that they did what they did October 7th. It's that it showed that actually it was a matter of political will. It wasn't a matter of political capacity. They could have done this if they wanted to, and they didn't. I think that is a profound indictment of the entire conservative movement.
Again, it's just like the funding of border walls for foreign countries or the protection of their boundaries. It's not that we can't do this. It's not that we don't know how to do it. It's not that we can't find the money. It's that we explicitly don't want to. And that's the very clear message that's being sent. And it doesn't matter if it's left or right. The answer is always the same. We can't protect you. And that's something that's only going to continue to cause incredible amounts of unrest and agitation among people. And you hope that eventually someone realizes this before things get bad. All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and switch over to the questions of the people. But before we do, where can people find your great work, man?
Everything is just on X. I guess that's what we call it now. So I'm at NJ Hochman, Hochman, on X. So find me there.
I will always call it Twitter. It always feels
that's my impulse. Yeah. I also you still say people tweet rather than they like X. So I don't know.
Like, what is that? It sounds like
X
someone's
post.
Making porn. It's terrible. Yeah. What are we doing, Derek? Right. Elon, please stop. All right. So, Alexandra Jean says, if the media is here to defend democracy, how is it not just state media propaganda arm for said democracy? It doesn't let you question democracy. Yeah, even better than that. It's not the propaganda arm of, it is the actual power driving. But I think the order, people also often call it regime media when they should be calling it media regime. But yeah, I hear you, man. If this is supposed to be defending free speech, but you aren't allowed to actually go ahead and question the things that are happening in the quote unquote democracy, then what are we doing here?
Yeah. And also, I mean, people have commented on this, but the sort of regime itself is anti anything that could be actually accurately described as democracy, right? So they're not really pro-democracy. Yeah.
Not that is in and of itself the best system, in my opinion. However, the joke is that people pretend that we even still have that. All right. Creeper Weirdo says, but guys, think of the racism that hasn't ended. Yes. Remember, guys, anywhere and everywhere, if someone might do a heckin' racism, you must destroy civilization to stop it. That is your job as a, I don't know, freedom-loving democracy and enjoying America. Creeper Weirdo says, are you guys questioning and voting my democracy? Indeed. Very, very dangerous behavior here. All right, guys. Well, that's everything for today. Thank you once again for listening. Of course, you should be making sure to check out all of Nate's stuff. He does great work. And if it's your first time on this channel, make sure that you go ahead and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Make sure that you go ahead and turn on your notifications. Click that bell. Otherwise, you won't see these videos when they go live, the streams when they go live. Love having you guys here to comment when we are doing this. So make sure that you have notifications on so you can do that. Of course, if you'd like to listen to these as podcasts while you're working out, mowing the lawn, driving around, doing whatever, make sure that you go ahead and go to your favorite podcast platform, subscribe to Auron MacIntyre Show. Make sure that you go ahead and leave a rating or review. It helps with the algorithm. And lastly, if you'd like to go ahead and pre-order my book, The Total State, you can go ahead and do that on Amazon. You can do it Barnes & Nobles, Books A Million, everything else, guys. Make sure to check that out. Thank you, everyone, for coming by. And as always, we'll talk to you next time.